My honor and privilege to give the first talk. Now, over the last 12 months, I've taught the online course Belief and the Shakespeare Authorship Question 4 times through OLLI, which is the OSHA Lifelong Learning Institute here in Ashland on the Southern Oregon University campus. The course comprised 6 classes and each was an hour long. All these students are older adults and I taught about 70 of them in total. The first 3 classes were on reasonable doubt and the second 3 were entitled, Why Should Edward de Vere Not Be Considered a Candidate for Authorship? The response was terrific, very heartening, which is both good and bad. The good point was, well, they were certainly buying what I was telling them, but the bad point was that there was basically no pushback from anybody over the course of all the classes. Apart from one minor quibble, one person said, really, my motive was to get more people to sign the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition Declaration. And if you haven't, by the way, here is a plug for doing that. So, rather than go into more detail about the course itself, I'm going to spend the rest of my time on a condensed version of the first part, Reasonable Doubt, in the hope it will serve as a good 101 for any newcomers here, and welcome to you if you are new. And I do have a suggestion at the end that perhaps might help all of us in a discussion with a Stratfordian. We shall see. In my experience, it's been very important to establish reasonable doubt before presenting the case for Oxford, which Tom Townsend is going to do. Otherwise, this is my view, one is presenting a solution in search of a problem when it comes to changing people's minds. I know not everybody agrees with me on that point. That is fine. So, William Shakespeare, A Reasonable Doubt. Do you all remember Bill Clinton's constant reminder to himself? Remember that? I used to have one for the Shakespeare Authorship Question. That didn't last very long, though, until I realized it's the emotion, stupid, when it comes to talking about reasonable doubt. As a Stratfordian friend of mine said when I rehearsed this talk with her, I bristled. Very understandable, because the Shakespeare of our culture is so embedded a belief that if he is attacked, then so are his believers. And I will be presenting unambiguous primary source evidence that contradicts the belief that we know who wrote the works of Shakespeare. But, as we all know, facts don't change the minds of most true believers, because humans understand the world through narratives. In the case of the Shakespeare Authorship Question, the narrative has taken the place of the facts. However much we flatter ourselves about our individual rationality, a good story, no matter how analytically deficient, lingers in the mind, resonates emotionally, and persuades more than the most compelling facts or data do. Why should we care about the authorship question? You get this question all the time. We've got the plays and the poems. Surely that's enough, isn't it? I would say to that question, why have biographies at all? If the biography of the greatest writer of all time doesn't matter, whose biography does? Why bother submitting your own biography, i.e. your resume, when you apply for a job? But more than that, and of course truth matters, we all know that, if you get Shakespeare wrong, you get the Elizabethan age wrong. And what we have right now is the wrong Elizabethan age, because we have an author stripped of meaning, one in whose works nothing of his life is recognizable. Let's go into terminology, shall we? I know this is second nature for many of you here, but we need to establish this from the beginning. Shakespeare is the man from Stratford. Why do we call him Shakespeare? Because his baptism entry said Shakespeare. S-H-A-K, no E, S-P-E-R-E. And his family spelled it that way as well. Let's continue with terminology. Shakespeare, the poet-playwright. Stratfordian, somebody thinks they're the same person, and a post or non-Stratfordian, somebody who thinks Shakespeare is a pseudonym or an allonym. An allonym is a real person's name which is then attached to somebody else. So the big question is this, or is it? Because my answer to this question is, of course he could have. It's the wrong question. Here's the right question. How did he write the works without leaving any unambiguous primary source evidence? What does unambiguous mean? It means clear, precise. What is primary source? It's a document, image, or artifact that provides evidence about the past. It's original, created contemporaneously with the event under discussion. So I've set my parameters. Using unambiguous primary sources, there are 5 points on which Stratfordians and post-Stratfordians or non-Stratfordians agree. We all agree on these 5 points. There was a man from Stratford called William Shakespeare, definitely. Successful in business. Oh yeah, won't contest that. Owned shares in theatre companies. There's evidence he was an actor in them. Yes, yeah, fine. Plays and poems were written and published under the name William Shakespeare. Yes. And we agree there are 9 instances of Shakespeare's name in connection with theatre companies. And it was spelled Shakespeare twice and Shakespeare 7 times. Here are those 7. Don't bother paying attention to this. All of this is on a handout at the end. No need to take notes at this particular point. So, Stratfordians say, and this is where we disagree, Stratfordians say because Shakespeare's name was spelled Shakespeare 7 times in connection with theatre, Shakespeare and Shakespeare are the same person. Because it would be way too bizarre a coincidence to think otherwise. Now, there's a logic that underpins that, which on the surface I think is fair, to tell you the truth. And the logic goes that 2 people in the same field of work at the same time, having the same name, have to be the same person. I'll say it again. The logic goes, 2 people, same field of work, same time, same name. They've got to be the same person. So ladies and gentlemen, Graham Greene, the Canadian actor, and Graham Greene, the novelist and playwright, they're the same person, everybody. Why? Because they were in London in theatre in the 1970s. Same person. How about Claire Asquith, who was a journalist for The Spectator, and Claire Asquith, the novelist? Same person, using that logic. And I really don't need to say anything about the 2 Michelle Williams. They're clearly the same person. So, these 3 counterexamples prove, all you need is 1 counterexample, right, to undo any premise or hypothesis. Prove that being in the same field of work at the same time with the same name does not prove they're the same person, but let's go with it. Let's assume the benefit of the doubt and assume that Shakespeare and Shakespeare were the same person. How can I find corroborating evidence of that? I can't use birthplace or birth date because they're assumed to be the same person. That won't get me anywhere. So my approach is going to be to look for, and you will hear this phrase over and over again, unambiguous evidence from primary sources that Shakespeare from Stratford-on-Avon was a poet-playwright. If I can find that, if I can do that, then we have to cancel the conference, okay? It's all over. Now, the thing is, where am I going to look for that? And I've got 9 categories where I'm going to look for proof, unambiguous primary source evidence proof. The man from Stratford was a poet-playwright. Life, death, bust in the church, gravestone, town of Stratford. Thousands of people work with him, biographies, people from whom we can reasonably expect evidence, and the first folio. All right, now, there are about 70 plus documents that Stratfordians and post-Stratfordians generally agree are related to the life of the man from Stratford. We're not going to, you can quibble about some of them, I'm not going to. So I've summarized these here. They're on a handout for you. Don't try and read the lines. Pay attention to the color, please. These are all color-coded. Red is his personal life. This is personal stuff. You've got baptism, you've got marriages and all the rest of that. And then you've got 2 other colors to pay attention to. Black is straight business, and blue is business as well, but it's business associated with the theater. So black and blue there, okay? All right, so let's just keep going here. Pay attention to the colors. You'll have the handout at the end. Lots of business, isn't there? Lots and lots. Oh, there's some more red in there. This is good. Lots and lots and lots of business until we get to 1616 when he dies. So to summarize, you've got his birth, you've got his death, and in between you have an awful lot of business, tax defaulting, suing, and being sued stuff. So to summarize that, then, everything shows it's the life of a businessman. I ask you this question. Suppose the works had been composed by Anonymous, and you went looking for Anonymous, and you ended up with those 70 plus documents. Would you say, duh, obviously that's the man who was the author? I don't think you would. And I'm trying to use logic here, but wait a minute. Let me argue against myself, because people say absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You hear that a lot in the debate. Well, is that really true? If you say you have a dog, and I go to your house, there are no dog bowls, dog house, bed or cage, leash, etc., that would normally be expected to be there, and you can't tell me where they are, that's evidence. You probably don't have a dog. Shall we turn the dog into an author? If you have a pet author, and I go to your sources, there are no manuscripts, payments for writing, records of correspondence, etc., that would normally be expected to be there, you can't tell me where they are, that's evidence. You probably don't have an author. Now, just because it's evidence, that is not proof. I need to make that very clear. I cannot prove that William Shakespeare from Stratford-on-Avon did not write the works, because in the absence of confirming evidence, one cannot prove a negative. You have to understand that. So I'm not saying that. I'm saying it is evidence. But wait a minute, am I cherry-picking documents? Am I just picking stuff, am I going to, that supports my case and totally ignores all the other cases? I mean, look, documents get lost, don't they? I mean, fire, flood, plague, pestilence, you need to wrap your fish and chips in something. I mean, there's lots of reasons why we would have lots of pages, manuscripts, etc. missing. Enter Diana Price, who I think has written an amazing book called Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography. What she did was pioneer the phrase literary paper trails to give credence to the belief that a person was an author in Elizabethan times. These are the 10, don't write them down, they're on a handout, and you've got evidence of having been paid to write, notice at death as a writer, and so on and so forth. So, to be acknowledged as a writer in the Elizabethan period, you'd have to have evidence in not all of these boxes, but at least one of them anyway. So what she did was, she came up with this. Let me point out, here are 24 authors, 24 contemporaries, okay? 24 contemporaries. Here are, across the top, the literary paper trails, and you just put checks in boxes. It's standard stuff. Ben Jonson, every single box. I was surprised by Christopher Marlowe. Only 3, as it turns out. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is why we don't have a Ben Jonson and a Christopher Marlowe authorship question at all. Because we have evidence, unambiguous primary source evidence, that they were authors. Anybody, there's a lot of bright people in this room, anybody notice a name that's missing? Yeah. This one down here. From unambiguous primary source evidence, not one box is checked, which makes Shakespeare the only alleged writer since the invention of the printing press for whom all evidence that he was a writer is posthumous. That's an extraordinary claim, which requires extraordinary evidence. So when I keep repeating unambiguous primary source evidence, I do for a reason. That's precisely the kind of evidence we have for 24 contemporaneous authors. Why does Shakespeare get a free pass? He should not. All right, remember what I'm doing. I'm trying to prove that the guy from Stratford was a poet-playwright, and I've got these 9 categories. His life does not show a thing. Let's check his death and see what we get from that. In his will, there's no mention of all of these at all. Now, one would suppose that there might be. Now, this is where the Stratfordian case goes, yeah, well, there's a reason why that's not there, and there's a reason why this isn't there, and there's a I'm not looking for reasons why something isn't there. I'm looking for reasons to believe that, or know that something is there. Do you get the subtle difference on that? That really sort of, it's interesting how Stratfordians say, here's the reasons why it's not there. I would like to know where it is in that case. How about eulogies? When Ben Jonson died, the poems of 43 elegists were published close to the date of his death. There was absolute silence for Shakespeare. Even friends and family never recorded evidence of him being a writer. Not even diarists who kept such complete and interesting records, their diaries were published, wrote of his death. So there's nothing here to indicate he was a playwright. Strike 2 on my list. Bust in the church, that's Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-on-Avon. We go inside, there's a bust right here. There's a plaque underneath it. This here, well, I should do this, shouldn't I? This here is the plaque right there underneath the bust. First thing I want you to notice is what's in the red box. It doesn't say Shakespeare, it says Shakespeare, which is completely in keeping with his personal records. He never spelled his name with an E after the K. Let's read this. I'm going to read this out to you. It really is fascinating. It is in two parts. We've got some Latin up here and some English down here. Let's do the English first, shall we? So it goes, "Stay, passenger, why goest thou by so fast? Read if thou canst." I've always thought that was kind of rude. If you can... "Whom envious death hath placed within this monument." Doesn't say within, it says within this monument. Shakespeare. "With whom quick nature died, whose name doth deck this tomb, far more than costs he all that he hath wit, leaves living art, but page to serve his wit." And I agree with all of you. I've no idea what that says. That is totally incomprehensible. I know it doesn't say he's a poet-playwright, mind you. Now, how about the Latin? Let's take a look at the Latin, shall we? Maybe there's a clue in the Latin. The Latin translates here, "Earth covers, people mourn, Olympus holds, Peleus, Socrates, and Mara." Who are these guys? Well, Peleus was known as Nestor, and he was a Greek king, mostly known for exercises of judgment. His most famous judgment was advice to disguise oneself as someone of far greater ability. Socrates, the second one here, never wrote a line himself, as far as is known. Didn't create any plays or poetry. Indeed, according to Plato, Socrates would ban poets from his ideal republic. And Arte Moronum compares Shakespeare to the most famous epic poet of Latin antiquity, known to us as Virgil. But why Virgil? The leading historical literary source for Shakespeare was Ovid, who's not mentioned at all. And why Mount Olympus, when Parnassus is figuratively known as the symbol of poetry and art. But remember, there's lots of excuses and reasons, and oh, it's this and it's not that, and so on and so forth. I'm looking for reasons for something. There is nothing in the church that says he is a poet-playwright, but I haven't left the church yet, actually. Let's go to the gravestone, shall we? No name on it, doesn't say William Shakespeare. It's probably his because his wife's on one side, his daughter's on the other. I've got no problem with that whatsoever. I think he could have put his name on it rather than some doggerel curse like that. Anyway, let's move away from the church, shall we? Still looking for evidence that he was a poet-playwright. Let's wander into the town itself. Now, despite the first folio's mention of Stratford, the town didn't achieve fame as Shakespeare's birthplace until the actor David Garrick put on a Shakespeare festival in 1769. That's 153 years after Shakespeare's death. One of the first things he tried to do was to find the birthplace on Henley Street. There are records that a Shakespeare family lived on Henley Street. So he goes asking people. Well, this is 153 years later. And a couple of guys say, well, we think it's that place. And so Garrick said it's that place. And honestly, I am sounding facetious. That is how it happened. And as I said here, thus was an architectural myth born. A very honest man, a director of the Birthplace Trust, said in 1947, the records do not indicate precisely at what house in Stratford-upon-Avon William was born. That's another way of saying we don't know. Yet Shakespeare and Stratford are so important to the UK economy that two acts of Parliament link them. Here's the 1961 Birthplace Trust Act. Just look at the red box down here. The house generally known and reputed to be the house in which William Shakespeare was born, and this is the place you may have gone there. The roof tiles and railings are 20th century. Everything else, I mean everything but the cellar, dates from mid-Victorian times. Yet we tour the house and we're told this is the house where William Shakespeare was born, grew up and played, ate meals in the hall and slept and dreamt in these rooms. There are two other houses, by the way, on the tour. One's Anne Hathaway's cottage. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Arden family lived there, none. And then we have the home of Susanna Hall, beautiful Sud Tud, as I like to call it, building. And that was built in 1951. But let's not let facts get in the way of making money. You can tour those for about $80 for a family to tour those three buildings. I'd like to thank Alexander Waugh, who's not here, for the information I've stolen for this part of the presentation. Honestly, if anything gets my blood boiling about this, it's Stratford. If somebody wanted to make a case for fraud, There is so much evidence for doing it, but who in England is going to do that? The national hero, you're going to say bad things about the national hero? I don't think so. Let's go on. Remember what I'm trying to do. Find evidence the man from Stratford was a poet-playwright. I've struck out several times. Let's go to the thousands of people. Who are these thousands of people? Well, I get this from a Mr. A.J. Leon from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, who says, and this sounds so compelling, doesn't it? Somebody from the Birthplace Trust says, at least 14 other writers mentioned it by name as a playwright and a poet, discussed his work. Printers and publishers worked with him. Readers, actors, and theatre audiences were part of the living and breathing testimony of thousands of people. I'm sorry, that was fiction. Complete, utter fiction. Mr. Leon cannot back up any of it in talking about the man from Stratford, and that's the guy that I'm focusing on. So what's going on? Well, authors of quotes like these are using impersonal evidence and turning it into personal evidence of direct knowledge of Shakespeare. When people wrote about Shakespeare the playwright, they were writing about his plays and poems. They wrote book reviews. They quoted Shakespearean lines. Nobody wrote about Shakespeare the writer as though they actually knew him. And yet traditional orthodox biographers weave into their narrative of Shakespeare's life all those book reviews, literary commentary, as though they constituted personal evidence. What is personal evidence? It's evidence that either demonstrates the writer knew the subject or is produced by a writer documented to have known the subject personally. If it's just expressing an opinion, it's impersonal evidence. Just a quick example of this. Anybody read Tana French novels? I think she's great. I'm a big fan of hers. This is from a review. Morality tales are too often pedantic, out of touch, simplistic. Tana French has been writing against that grain, writing gothic crime novels that reckon with privilege and the haunted, cracking back channels of police departments. I ask you this question. Suppose I'd written that review or review like that. Would you assume automatically I knew Tana French? I don't think so. And if when Tana French spoke to me, wrote to me, showed me her notes, we discuss how that is personal evidence. But that's what Shakespeare's biographers do. They take impersonal evidence from reviewers, critics, etc., evidence with no connection whatsoever to William Shakespeare, and turn it into personal evidence. I remind you of this slide I showed you earlier. This column, you may not be able to see it from the back of the room. This is personally referred to as a writer. Of the 24, every single one was referred to as a writer. There's only one on the list for whom that is not true. Let's keep going. So much for the thousands of people. How about his biographies? I'm going to give this short shrift. What are you going to do if you're a biographer? And this is what you have to work with. Now, if you're writing the life of a businessman, great. And actually, I think the guy from Stratford was probably a very canny businessman. It might be a really interesting book. But as far as biography is concerned, of a literary form, and I love this quote from the University of London, the frustrating absence of rich details of Shakespeare's daily life, one might say any details, has arguably resulted in some somewhat strained works of biography, but has also doubtless contributed to the development of a literary subgenre where Shakespeare himself is cast as a character, or in other words, you check this out for yourselves, biographies are filled with a history of Elizabethan theatre, Tudor times, accounts of everyday life. But when it comes to the man himself, there are no other facts apart from the 70 plus that I've mentioned. However, we do find much use of the words probably, possibly, could have, would have, must have, we can suppose, no doubt, etc. Two more. People from whom we can reasonably expect evidence. This is work from Ramon Jimenez. We can identify at least 10 people who personally knew the William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon or met his daughter Susanna. At least 6 of them, probably all, possibly all of them, were aware of plays and poems published under the name of one of the country's leading playwrights, William Shakespeare. These are the 10, and I mentioned the 3 in red in my class. I'm not going to go into details here, there just isn't time. Excuse me. However, I will mention John Hall. That's Shakespeare's son-in-law. copious diarist, writer, so on and so forth, never mentioned his father-in-law once. If you want to find out reasons why he didn't, there are plenty of Stratfordians who will tell you why he didn't. I don't want to know why he didn't. I want the evidence that he did write the works. Last one, the biggie, the real biggie. I'm touching the surface here. This is the tip of the iceberg. Many people will speak on the first folio during this conference. Published in 1623, in it, and I'll slow down, there are two words, without which the Shakespeare industry, or as my friend Bonner calls it, the Shakespeare industrial complex, as we know it today, would not exist. Here are the two words, Avon and Stratford. Where do they come from in the prefatory material? Well, Ben Jonson's preface says Sweet Swan of Avon, we all know that phrase. Leonard Digges' poem says Stratford Monument, interestingly enough. It doesn't say monument, it says M-O-N-I, which actually means monument, but it also means a body of work. For Stratfordians, this is unambiguous primary source evidence that the author was from Stratford-on-Avon. All you have to do is take the order of the words, it goes Avon first and Stratford second, reverse them, stick in two hyphens and an upon, and you've got Stratford-on-Avon. So, is Stratford unique in some fashion? Well, not really. I mean, there's a Stratford that was just outside the walls of the City of London in the 17th century. It's still there, by the way. It's got its own tube station these days because the city has grown to meet Stratford. But in the first folio dedication from Ben Jonson, we have Sweet Swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear and make those flights upon the banks of Thames. Rather interesting, because you have two rivers, don't you? You've got the Avon and you've got the Thames. So, question then becomes, well, is that unambiguous? Is Avon only a river? No, it's not. It turns out, according to William Camden, wrote this in 1607, Avon was a name for Hampton Court Palace on the River Thames. Well, what's the big deal about Hampton Court Palace? It's a palace, right? Yes, but in the great hall of Hampton Court, we have the site of many stage performances, including Shakespeare plays, and King James and Queen Elizabeth watched plays here regularly. So shall we go back then? Is Stratford-on-Avon unambiguous? I don't think so. Plus, it's also posthumous. A little bit more in the first folio. Hemmings and Condell, Shakespeare's, fellow shareholders and actors are credited as the driving force behind the first folio, and they claim to have collected Shakespeare's manuscripts, not for profit, but as an homage to so worthy a friend and fellow as was our Shakespeare. Samuel Schoenbaum said, this has been called the most crucial single document in the annals of authorship contribution. So one should pay attention to it. Now, do you remember those 7 non-posthumous spellings of the man's name? So if there were any evidence anywhere else that Shakespeare from Stratford was a poet-playwright, this slide really would be irrelevant. But we've already seen the same name, same area of work at the same time doesn't mean the people have to be the same. Therefore, this evidence becomes crucial. And the ambiguous first folio mention of Avon and Stratford are the only reason we're looking there for authorship. There's no other reason why, based on the documents that we've seen of his life, would we think of authorship. Or more to the point, because we don't know that Avon and Stratford in the first folio mean Stratford upon Avon, we can't say a reference to Shakespeare in the first folio is a reference to the man from Stratford on Avon. It could equally well have been a pseudonym. As it stands, saying William Shakespeare is William Shakespeare because of a page in the first folio is simply circular reasoning. Okay, now, there we go. I've gone through the list right there. I've not found evidence that that man from Stratford was a poet-playwright. But I want to add a little bit more. This is something I didn't do in the class. It just occurred to me a few days ago. So sort of go to one side a little bit now, if you will, and I'll incorporate what I talked about into my answer to this, the eyeball rolling critic who thinks you're a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist. So how do you deal with that? What do you do? You know, quite honestly, I think the first thing that we should do is notice the anger that rises up inside ourselves too. Okay, I think it's important to do that because now we are being attacked for the reasons that other people think we're attacking them. So let's keep the playing field level, shall we? But first thing to do, I think, is acknowledge that William Shakespeare from Stratford could have written the works and then, like all good engineers do, restate the problem. The problem is this question: how did he write the works without any unambiguous primary source evidence? Then go on to state there are 24 contemporaries for whom we do have unambiguous primary source evidence. Why should Shakespeare not be judged by the same standard? Why should he be let off the hook? And this is simply a summary of those 3 points. I've had a tiny little bit of success with this approach. I haven't practiced it a lot. Now, the conversation then can go in lots of different directions. One thing they could say is, well, it's in the first folio. First step. Acknowledge the first folio is pretty good prima facie evidence. Yes, absolutely. And then point out, but it's not unambiguous. It doesn't say Stratford and Avon. There are many Stratfords. Hampton Court was known as Avon. And it's not a primary source because it was published 7 years after Shakespeare's death. And then they can go on and say the names are the same. Acknowledge the spelling. Yeah, that's pretty compelling. But then use the names of the 3 people that I just told you about to say, yeah, but the logic underlining it, I'm afraid, it does not hold up. We have 3 counter-examples. To quickly summarize what I've tried to do in my classes and in this presentation, I apologize for talking quickly. I wanted to get in as much information as possible. I've read closely, I've thought critically, evaluated sources, corroborated accounts, and backed up claims from primary sources. But I will give the final words here to the Stratfordian Professor Sir Stanley Wells, Honorary President of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, who says, the time for tolerance is over. There is no room for reasonable doubt. And about people like me, us all in this room, we're not just talking about people who are bonkers or intellectually challenged. We're talking about people whose ideas are insidious, reactionary, and dangerous. Thank you very much. Thank you. Richard, could you close that, please? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Tom, you're next, right?